Welcome back, everybody, to another lecture here in History 1301. And what we're going to be going over today is the outbreak of the American Revolution, and ultimately going down that road of how we see the development of an American nation. Now, where we last left off within lectures, we talked about how loyal British subjects over in the American colonies went from being loyal to essentially reluctant rebels, where they were protesting the taxes that were being issued by British Parliament, and all along the way they were hoping that Parliament would step down and eventually restore colonial authority back over in the colonies. However, Parliament was not willing to do this, and we saw that escalation, or that situation continue to escalate, and eventually led to the first shots of what would be the American Revolution at Lexington and Concord. Now, after the initial battles at Lexington and Concord, we will see that the American Rebellion, which was meant initially to have the rights as Englishmen restored, is going to completely explode and eventually turn us down the road to where they would call for their own independence. Now, the war itself after Lexington and Concord is going to escalate by May of 1775, mainly because we'll see that the colonists, after gaining a major victory against British arms at Lexington and Concord, they're going to begin to turn to other regions that the British had control of throughout the American North, at the time the American Northwest, but in the American Northeast today. And we'll see that they would first set their sights on Fort Ticonderoga. Now, there will be mostly Connecticut militiamen, as well as some other militiamen who would be called up, who would be under the command of one Benedict Arnold, who would look to capture this British fort and bring in all the weapons and ammunition, and mainly the cannons, to the American cause. And they will successfully capture Fort Ticonderoga. However, by doing so, it ensured that moving forward, this war of rebellion would eventually turn us down the road to independence. Now, how so? Well, it's because with Fort Ticonderoga, it demonstrated that Americans were not only content with defending their rights within their own territories, but rather were willing to go out and capture British installations. And we'll see in a little bit that will lead to a British response that will send tens of thousands of individuals across the Atlantic to come over to fight the American colonists. In the meantime, the war will only continue to escalate, because by June of 1775, we'd see the first major land battle would take place when we see British soldiers attack Bunker Hill, or I should say Breed's Hill, at the Battle of Bunker Hill just outside of Boston. And through these two events, when word of it arrives back over in England, it would convince King George III that this wasn't a mere rebellion that he should give in to, but rather that he should stomp out this rebellion to restore British authority. And in the coming months, he would issue a proclamation stating that the American colonies were in a state of open rebellion. Now, with the battles at Fort Ticonderoga as well as Bunker Hill, it's going to kind of undermine basically the political platform of a new organization that was beginning to convene by spring of 1775, and it would be that of the Second Continental Congress. Now, the Second Continental Congress is going to convene in May of 1775, and they're really going to inherit this escalating situation that we see out in New England. Now, their hope was that after the battles of Lexington and Concord, the militia forces within Massachusetts would merely just kind of stay their ground, that they would only resist the British if the British were to go on the offensive. However, with Fort Ticonderoga, it demonstrated that the colonists were beginning to take the offensive, guaranteeing that the British would issue some sort of response and be less willing to reconcile. And this just kind of puts the Second Continental Congress in a very precarious light. And we'll see it will impact their decision-making moving forward. And realizing that the war was beginning to escalate far beyond what they were hoping for, this Congress is going to have to appoint a new commander to coordinate events occurring in New England and throughout the colonies to hopefully ensure that the militia would be a disciplined army that would listen to Congress. And then in June, just 2 days before the Battle of Bunker Hill, on June 15th, 1775, this is where we'll see the British colonists are going to unanimously appoint George Washington to be the leader of the Continental Army. However, he won't be arrived to the Continental Army outside of Boston in time for Bunker Hill, but over the course of the next year, he will look to try to bring about discipline and organize a more European-style army out of this ragtag force. But it will be years to come before he'll be able to instill that discipline within the American army. But anyways, as they were returning to military manners and trying to kind of mop up after what's occurred at Fort Ticonderoga as well as Bunker Hill, the main goal of the Second Continental Congress was to continue to protest the British government for all their actions over the previous decade, from those taxes that they'd put on the colonies, as well as their response with force that we had seen at Lexington and Concord. And they would once again issue a document over to Great Britain calling for their restorations of their rights as Englishmen. And on July 5th, 1775, we'll see the Second Continental Congress is going to produce what's known as the Olive Branch Petition. Now, the reason I'm bringing up the Olive Branch Petition in particular is because it will demonstrate to us how even though we're a year out from the signing of the Declaration of Independence, even after we see some of these large battles take place, and even though we see that the American colonists had begun to take up arms against the British, they were still wanting to remain a part of the British Empire. Within the Olive Branch Petition, it basically once again protested the British government, stating they wanted their rights as Englishmen to be restored. And they would once again call on the king to restore order throughout the American colonies and allow their colonial assemblies once again to dictate their own law codes and to allow them to self-govern. Now, word of the Olive Branch Petition will eventually arrive back over in England, but when it arrives over in England, so will word of the Battle of Bunker Hill. And by this point in late 1775, King George III had no interest of reconciling with the American colonies. He saw this as a full-on rebellion, and he will send over tens of thousands of troops to go over to the American colonies to suppress the rebellion within his realms. And he would issue a royal proclamation come October stating such, saying the American colonists were in open rebellion, and anybody who took up arms against the British soldiers who would arrive would be seen as traitors. And the penalty for those traitors would be death by hanging. This was where famously, when word of his response to the Olive Branch Petition arrives back in the American colonies, Benjamin Franklin would make the remark, "Well, now we will assuredly all hang together, or assuredly we will hang separately." And by the end of the year 1775, it became increasingly well known to the American people that they could no longer continue to protest to regain their rights as Englishmen, but rather they had to take more drastic steps if they were to restore their rights as proper Englishmen. And this is where at the beginning of 1776 that they would begin a push for independence. Now, this push for independence, you can argue that it had begun back with the First Continental Congress. We see that there were several Massachusetts delegates, including the likes of John and Samuel Adams, who believed that independence should be achieved. However, most colonies were reluctant to break away from the British crown, mainly because either they were proud British subjects or they feared the fact of a British response to where if they failed, it could lead to eventually, obviously, these hangings that I mentioned a moment ago. And so many were reluctant throughout 1775 to take that step. But when they heard of King George III's response, they no longer saw him as a patriot king, but rather saw him as a tyrant. And this will convince many Americans that perhaps they should start thinking about achieving their own independence if they wanted to restore their rights as Englishmen. However, one individual who would do more than any others to convince Americans that they needed to seize the moment and gain their independence would be a man by the name of Thomas Paine, who was an English immigrant who arrived over in the United States in 1774, who would go on just 2 years later to write a very influential pamphlet, which is something that you guys will be reading on here in this week, that of Common Sense. Now, what Common Sense basically states is that America needed to seize a moment, or I should say the American colonists needed to seize a moment. That the British king was a tyrant as well as the British Parliament, and they did not look out for American interests. And that the best way to restore Americans' rights, or their rights as Englishmen, was to declare independence. And that if Americans didn't do such, Americans would be basically stupid not to do so. And with it being published in January of 1776, this will be very influential to convincing Americans that perhaps they should support this cause of independence. However, there were still many who were reluctant to. Because one thing we'll recognize, not just in the Revolution, but we'll talk about it in the Civil War, when you're going to push forth great issues like independence or emancipation later on, in order to ensure that they would be accepted by the people, you needed to give confidence to the people. They needed military victories to demonstrate that their cause was just and perhaps worth fighting for. Now, at the end of the year 1775, there wasn't a lot of these victories. Even though they had surrounded Boston, the American colonists had tried to invade Canada. That ended up unsuccessful. However, the beginning of 1776 and the 2 months following the issuing of Common Sense, there will be several battlefield victories for the American colonists. First, in February, down in North Carolina, at a place called Moore Creek's Bridge, we'll see that colonial patriots are going to defeat colonial loyalists who were loyal to the crown. That was a major patriot victory. Alongside that, in March of 1776, Boston would fall into the hands of the colonists after we see the British forces flee the city. And with these two victories, by the spring of 1776, it convinced the American people that perhaps their cause of winning independence was just. One by one, we'll see that the separate states now, or I should say the separate colonies, Virginia, South Carolina, New York, and several others, will begin to dissolve their own old colonial assemblies and construct new state governments that were basically independent from the British nation, securing the rights to self-government. However, by the summer of 1776, there wasn't a formal declaration, there wasn't a formal call stating the creation of a new nation. However, in June of that year, we will see that it will take a very different turn. Because on June 7th, 1776, Richard Henry Lee of Virginia is going to propose to the Second Continental Congress that these united colonies are and of the right ought to be free and independent states. And we call on debates to begin to discuss the issue of declaring their independence. And over the course of the next month after he issues this call in June of 1775, the Continental Congress would be focused on debating on whether or not the American colonies should be independent or if they should continue to try to seek reconciliation with Great Britain. Now, as we see these debates take place within the Second Continental Congress, there will also be a committee of 5 that will be formed that would be tasked with drafting a Declaration of Independence if the Congress were to adopt independence. Now, the committee of 5 will be made up of 5 delegates, 4 from the North, 1 from the South. 2 delegates, which you've never heard their names, that of Roger Sherman from Connecticut and Robert Livingston from New York, were more conservative. And they're not going to have a major role with basically writing the Declaration of Independence. However, the 3 individuals that will be tasked with writing and drafting the Declaration of Independence would be Benjamin Franklin from Pennsylvania, John Adams from Massachusetts, and Thomas Jefferson from Virginia. And you can look up the background on ultimately how Thomas Jefferson came to write the Declaration of Independence. But being from Virginia, he would be the one tasked with writing the Declaration. And on July 2nd, 1776, before he issues his draft to Congress, we'll see that Congress would vote to declare its independence and adopt his draft once it had been revised within Congress. John Adams would write that July 2nd would go down in the history books as a great day of celebration, but as we all know, it wouldn't be July 2nd that would be celebrated, but rather July 4th, when the Declaration of Independence, after it's been heavily revised, would ultimately be accepted by the Continental Congress. Now, just to talk about the Declaration of Independence itself, you're going to be reading it on your own time, but I do want to talk about a few phrases within this document. Now, there are several things that we'll find characteristic in future American politics from the Declaration of Independence, but a couple of phrases I wanted to point out was first, the phrase that all men were created equal. The question is, what does this mean? And we'll see America is going to struggle about that phrase in years to come. And I want y'all to remember that phrase because I'm going to allude to it in future lectures, especially as we lead up to the Civil War, because for the founders and for later generations, that phrase would mean very different things. Also, what Jefferson would highlight in his Declaration of Independence is that Americans should be guaranteed certain natural rights, that of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Now, why am I pointing this out? Well, it's because the Declaration of Independence itself, I guess you could say its preamble, with rhetoric like that, this isn't anything new. He was borrowing this from John Locke, and much of the rhetoric in the Declaration was likewise borrowed from other documents. And so many of the ideas that Jefferson was proposing with this Declaration of Independence, they weren't new ideas. Rather, he had either gotten it from previous political philosophers or even from previous documents that he himself had written. Now, outside of those phrases, the rest of the document after its preamble is just a list of grievances. We'll even see that Thomas Jefferson would complain that King George III had basically forced the American colonies to adopt the slave trade. Now, that'll be thrown out, but nonetheless, the other grievances that they had would stick. When it arrived over in Britain, it was made clear that the American colonists were determined to declare their independence and create a new nation. However, this was a point of no return because it ensured for this Continental Congress that if they were to fail, then ultimately their cause, as well as them, would be killed. Now, one thing we'll understand was with great causes like independence and later emancipation, it's one thing to declare them, it's another thing to secure them. Because even though the Americans have declared independence on July 4th, it was still a long road ahead. Because on that day, while the United States was formally created, there was still a lot of fighting that needed to take place so they could secure their independence. And the war would last on another bloody 7 years. So we're about to take a look at what it will take place in those next 7 years. So after the Americans have declared independence in July of 1776, it will be a tough road ahead for them to actually secure that independence and make sure that they don't fall back under British control. Now, after independence is declared, the war effort for the colonial cause isn't going to go in their favor, because we'll see while the beginning of the year 1776 was marked by a series of colonial victories, we'll see that the second half of 1776 would almost spell disaster for the Patriot cause. Now, the month after we see the signing of the Declaration of Independence in August of 1776, the British are going to return. After retreating out of Boston, the British Army had gone up to Canada, where they received much-needed reinforcements, and they would then turn their attention to attacking New York as opposed to Massachusetts. The belief was that if they attacked New York, it was a heavily divided state, they would gain a lot of support by some of the colonists, and two, by capturing New York, they could cut the colonial cause in two, between New England and the rest of the colonies. Now, when they land in New York, one individual or one colonist living in New York City would state that basically all of London was afloat out in New York's harbor. And there was over 30,000 British troops who were housed on those British naval vessels. Now, Washington himself, he had taken the Continental Army and led them south from Massachusetts. But even though his numbers were almost 20,000 at its peak, it would be no match for the disciplined and trained British Army. There would be a series of battles fought around New York City, the Battle of Manhattan, the Battle of Brooklyn, the Battle of Harlem Heights, and so on and so forth, to where Washington would lose. And he would virtually have to abandon the state of New York as well as New York City, retreating first back into New Jersey, later into Delaware, and then across the Delaware River into Pennsylvania. And by the end of the year of 1776, the war was not going in favor of the colonists. And it looks like at the end of the year that with Patriot morale beginning to plummet, that the war was virtually over, and that their cause was lost. By December of 1776, the once large Continental Army that numbered 20,000 men was a measly 3,000 men. And many American soldiers serving in his army were threatening to go home because they weren't getting any pay from the Second Continental Congress. However, only through another major pamphlet from Thomas Paine, that of the American Crisis, and through the fact that Washington would actually have to give his own money out of his pocket to pay his soldiers, and then he had to convince them to stay on to fight, that he would deliver them a major victory in the days to come, would we see him even have an army by the end of the year in 1776. Now, the next 10 days, from December 25th, 1776 to January 3rd, 1777, would prove to be the most vital 10 days of the Revolution. Because Washington's success or failure within this upcoming campaign would dictate whether or not the cause of independence would completely collapse and the British would regain the colonies, or if it would survive and live on. Now, first, on the night of December 25th, this is where we see that famous image of Washington crossing the Delaware. And he will cross with about a force of 5,000 men intent on attacking a town on the New Jersey side of the Delaware River called Trenton. He would surprise the Hessian forces, who were mercenaries hired by the British, and capture over 900 of them. A crucial victory. However, the British, they would look to respond to kick Washington back across the river, but before they can respond, Washington had already recrossed. That's one victory, but still many more were needed to be won. We'll see in the days to come he would recross the Delaware River, once again going into Trenton. And on January 2nd, 1777, to try to destroy Washington's army, we'll see that a British force under the command of Lord Charles Cornwallis will attack him. And even though Cornwallis will push Washington back, he won't utterly defeat him. He will comment that the following day he would utterly defeat Washington and bring about an end to the war for the rebellion. But when the British forces arrive in Trenton the following day, they will find that Washington had left. But rather, he had gone around them to their rear to attack the town of Princeton, to where this time he would surprise British regulars, capture them, and gain another major victory. And over the course of those 10 days, with the battles of Trenton and Princeton, with that pamphlet issued by Thomas Paine, that of American Crisis, it gave a much-needed adrenaline rush to the American cause, to where Americans were no longer losing faith, trying to go back home as a result of the losses of the previous year, but rather they were under the belief that perhaps they could pull this thing off and win independence, and there would be renewed faith within Washington as a result of this campaign. And shortly afterwards, he would go into his winter encampment for the rest of the campaign season until the beginning of the spring of 1777. And while we had seen the end of the year, 1776, being highlighted by Patriot defeats, the year 1777 would mark a turn in the tide of the war for the Patriot cause, not just through Washington's campaigns, but through other battles that would be won, especially out in New York. Now, by the spring of 1777, the British forces were beginning to realize that they had a formidable enemy in the American troops. While they may not have had the same discipline, they very much could put up a hell of a fight. And so the question for the British moving into 1777 is, how can they end this war over in the colonies? Well, their thought process was they needed to capture, still, once again, the state of New York. And at the beginning of the year, we'll see that the British High Command is going to create a plan to attack New York from three sides. All of these three armies that would be attacking New York were intent on eventually capturing the capital of New York at Albany. Now, one army would march up from New York City, from the south, up the Hudson River. Another army would march south from Lake Champlain down the Hudson River to Albany. And the last one would march from the west. And those two armies that I mentioned that weren't marching out of New York City, they'd be marching from Canada. And the purpose was that the British would converge on Albany, destroy Patriot sentiment in the region, take New York back into the British fold, and with it, bring about an end to the war the rebellion by cutting the colonies in two. Now, their plan will be off to a rough start, though. Meant to begin in the summer of 1777, we'll see that one of those armies that was meant to march from New York up to Albany is actually going to march a completely different direction. The army under General William Howe, he believed that the best way to defeat the colonists was to capture the capital city at Philadelphia. And so he will attack and capture Philadelphia. However, by his army turning south instead of north, it ensured that the colonists in New York could fight on much more equal terms against those two other British armies. The one that was marching from the west, from the Great Lakes, it would be stalled. And this would leave only one other major British army, under the command of one John Burgoyne, to march south from Lake Champlain down onto Albany. And he would be confronted by an old comrade who was commanding the Continental Army in that region, but the man by the name of Horatio Gates. And they would eventually clash at a town by the end of September called Saratoga. And it will be here that the American Revolution would completely turn, or the tide of the revolution would be completely be turned. Now, at the end of September, we'll see that Horatio Gates as well as John Burgoyne had basically an equal-sized army. They will engage in a series of battles, but by the beginning of October, with the local countryside, with local militiamen coming to the aid, not of the British, but rather to the Patriots, the Patriot Army would begin to swell, outnumbering the British by almost 2-1. Surrounding the British within Saratoga, laying siege to it, trying to slowly starve them into submission. And on October 17, 1777, after two failed attempts to break out of the city, the British Army under John Burgoyne would be forced to surrender to Horatio Gates. As a result, almost 6,000 British troops would surrender, over 7,000 arms, numerous cannons, over to the American cause. And why is that so important? Well, it's because at the time it was one of the worst humiliations for the British Army in their history. More importantly, another power had begun to look in on the conflict. And they saw that this battle, it convinced them that the Americans could actually pull this thing off if they were to get just a little bit more aid. When word of the Battle of Saratoga arrives back over in England, it will have its own repercussions, but as it arrives back over in Europe, it's also going to convince the French, the long rivals of the British, to enter the war on the American side. And in February of 1778, after hearing the word of the American victory at the Battle of Saratoga, the French would open up negotiations with Benjamin Franklin, who was the ambassador to France at the time, and they would agree to a treaty of alliance to where France would effectively enter the war. Now, why is this crucial for the American cause? And eventually leads them down the road to victory, because not only are they going to be getting the French soldiers who would help them out on the front lines, but they would be getting the French Navy. And more significantly, the British. This was no longer just for them a war within their American colonies, but rather this was a global conflict. They had to start thinking about defending colonies in Canada, colonies in Florida, colonies in the Caribbean, as well as throughout the world. It had effectively turned the American Revolution from a local conflict to a global conflict. And many British soldiers are going to have to be sent to other places outside the Americas, and it would ensure in the long run that the Americans, if they outlast the British, they could win their independence. Not to mention, also have the British Army, they'll have the French Navy enter the picture, and the British no longer would have supremacy along the Atlantic seaboard. Shortly afterwards, We'll see that several French officers would also arrive over in the American colonies trying to help train up the American army. Most noteworthy would be that of the Marquis de Lafayette, who would look to not only train up the American army, but provide sufficient funds in exchange for becoming a major general in the army. Alongside that, there would be other European officers who would come to the Americans' aid, most notably that of Baron von Steuben, who would arrive, who was a Prussian, who would train up the American military at Valley Forge. And with the French entry into the war, with Washington's army outside of Valley Forge gaining much needed discipline and training, they would go on the offensive at the beginning of 1778, push the British back into New York City to where they would remain for the remainder of the war. And the war that had been dominating the conflict in the North for the previous couple of years would enter a stalemate. Not a lot is going to happen. And the British, as a result of the French entering the war, they have to rethink their strategy if they're going to reclaim the American colonies. And this is where they're going to turn their attention to the southern colonies. Now, by the beginning of the war, not a whole lot of action has taken place within the American southern colonies. There had been a couple of expeditions by the British to go into the American southern colonies, but not a whole lot of enthusiasm went behind those efforts. But by late 1778, we'll see that the British forces, now under the command of one Sir Henry Clinton, are going to renew interest in the southern colonies because they recognized with the French entrance into the war, the colonists had a real possibility of gaining their independence. And if this were to occur, the British wanted to ensure that they kept at least a few of their colonies. And most notably, they wanted to keep the southern colonies because they were the most profitable and the richest colonies within the original 13 colonies. So they will launch first an incursion into Georgia to capture Savannah, and from there they would then march up through the southern colonies all the way up to Virginia. Now by late 1778, the British forces, they will land in Savannah, Georgia, and they will capture it relatively quickly. And they would then turn their attention next to South Carolina. Now also, after they capture Savannah, what's also going to play into their strategy of why they want to take over the southern colonies is they believe that the southern colonies also had the most loyalist sentiment. They believe that most Southerners would actually want to stay loyal to the crown as opposed to declaring their independence. However, this would prove to be false in the coming days. But nonetheless, there was great loyalist sentiment which would develop in a civil war, which I'll talk about here in a second. But after the capture of Savannah, we'll then see that the British, by the beginning of 1780, would march further north into the southern colonies, capturing Charleston in South Carolina, capturing an American army under the command of Benjamin Lincoln, a number of 5,000 men, entering a major humiliation for the Continental Army. But the British weren't done. They would go out into the countryside. Now the army was under the command of Lord Charles Cornwallis, and if you've seen the film The Patriot, you loosely kind of know what follows after the fall of Charleston. Cornwallis wanted to break the back of the Continental Army, destroy the Continental Army, and then hopefully convince most Southerners to join the British cause. He defeated the Continental Army at the Battle of Camden in August of 1780. And with it, there was no army that would stop him from marching into North Carolina and eventually into Virginia. However, this is where he will have a fatal mistake. As he goes out into the countryside, after he destroys that army, him, as well as two infamous officers, that of Lieutenant Colonel Bannister Tarleton, as well as Major Patrick Ferguson, Lord Charles Cornwallis is going to wage a war against basically the people of South Carolina, as well as the American colonies countryside. He will basically tell the colonists out in the countryside to be loyal to the crown or suffer the consequences. Now, unlike what's depicted in the film The Patriot, these individuals will go out and burn plantations, but they're not going to kill civilians. But nonetheless, issuing out such an ultimatum won't be popular. And we'll see that American militia, the only, or I should say colonial militia, really the only force that were confronting Cornwallis at this point, are going to desperately try to slow him down and keep him from getting to their countryside, or firesides. We'll see all throughout the rest of 1780, there will be a guerrilla war that would be waged. And these American militia would be successful in keeping Cornwallis bottled up in South Carolina. We'll see they would gain a major victory at the Battle of Kings Mountain in October 1780, which would effectively turn the tide of the war in the South. However, even so, with these militia, they weren't enough to stop Cornwallis, because over time he could whittle them down. And if the Continental Army did not arrive back soon, it could spell disaster. But the Continental Army will return by the end of 1780. And it will have a new commander. Now, the commander of the Continental Army at Camden in the previous August was Horatio Gates. But after he had been utterly defeated, he was thrown out of command. And a new man would take command of the Continental Army in the South. That of one Nathaniel Greene, who was basically a carbon copy of General Washington. He will come to the South, take command of the Continental Army, and he will employ a strategy that Washington had employed up in the North that I didn't mention earlier, a war of attrition, to not sacrifice the Continental Army, but rather engage in a series of ambushes so that way the war effort could live on. He will take command by the end of 1780, and he will begin to conduct this type of war. And we'll see his forces will inflict a major defeat against the forces under the British at the Battle of Cowpens, in January 1781. He won't be personally present for that battle, but his forces, a part of his plan, will be. And he will help further turn the tide in the war in the South. Now, as these events are developing, I do want to mention one thing. The war in the South will be particularly ugly. You will read about it in one of your articles. It will almost be somewhat of a civil war. You'll see family fighting against family, friend against friend, and so on and so forth. And it'll be relatively ugly from both sides to where both sides would commit atrocities. But as the Civil War was raging, Greene will take command, and he will try to turn effectively the tide in favor of the Patriots. Now, Greene, he will win a major victory, or his forces will win a major victory in January 1781, and he will then begin to go through North Carolina, hoping to stop Cornwallis's march to the south, and he effectively will do so. And even though he's handed a defeat at the Battle of Guilford Courthouse, it demonstrated at this battle that even though the British had won this victory, it was a very costly one, to where they had lost almost 25% of their numbers. And one member of the British Parliament would remark that if they were to suffer another such victory, it would doom their cause in the American colonies. And Greene, after this battle, he had pushed Cornwallis into Wilmington, North Carolina. And he had turned the tide of the war, and he would begin to turn his attention back to recapturing South Carolina. But Cornwallis wasn't done, because he was still hopeful of perhaps ending this war over in the American colonies. And after he was forced into Wilmington, North Carolina, as Greene begins to go into South Carolina to regain all that territory, we'll see Cornwallis will march into Virginia, invading that region, and eventually establishing a base of operations at a place called Yorktown. Now, Yorktown itself, it's based off a peninsula on the James River just below the town of Richmond, Virginia, where we see it today. And why is this important? Why is the topography important? Well, it's because being placed there, it puts Cornwallis in a very vulnerable position. The peninsula is very narrow, where it connects to the land. And if the Continental Army were to arrive there, his escape by land would be cut off. Not to mention, if the French Navy finally shows up off the Atlantic coast, they could cut off his only route of escape by the sea. And this is exactly what will happen. By September of 1781, in what was the race to the Chesapeake, the French Navy would beat the British Navy to the Chesapeake Bay. They would then engage in a naval battle with the British and actually win, cutting off Cornwallis's only route of retreat from the sea. In the meantime, the Continental Army under Washington, as well as his French reinforcements, under one General Rochambeau, are going to march south from New York. And they're going to cut off his other route of retreat across land. And what will begin is a siege of Cornwallis's forces. And by October 17, 1781, almost 4 years to the day since the British surrender at Saratoga, the British forces under Lord Charles Cornwallis would surrender to the Continental forces, effectively ending the major fighting within the Revolutionary War. Now, this is, as I mentioned, the end of the major fighting within the American colonies during the Revolutionary War. However, this is only for these major battles. We'll continue to see skirmishes and fightings will carry on for a further 2 years. We'll see the war will go on until 1783. But nonetheless, the major campaigning, the major pitched battles were over. And when word of the Battle of Yorktown arrives back over in Britain, even though King George III was determined to continue the fight against the American colonists, Parliament realized the war was unpopular amongst the British people, that the American colonists simply weren't going to submit. By the beginning of 1782, they would reach out to Benjamin Franklin to begin peace negotiations. And by the year 1783, after being given consent from French forces, or I should say from the French government, Benjamin Franklin, John Jay, and John Adams would be appointed to a commission to open up negotiations with the British to bring about an end to the war. And on September 3rd, 1783, a new Treaty of Paris would be signed. The Treaty of Paris of that year. And this is where I mentioned to y'all, remember the difference between the, as I write down the wrong date, remember the difference between the two Treaty of Parises. Now, the Treaty of Paris, as you could probably guess, would bring about an end to the American Revolution, and it would grant America its independence. However, there will be several other clauses that will be associated with this treaty. In a major diplomatic win, the Americans would double the size of their possessions. Not only would the 13 colonies leave Great Britain's authority, but rather all the land out in the Ohio River Valley, everything basically east of the Mississippi River, with the exception of Florida, would be the colonists. Very land they had fought for during the French and Indian War. Not to mention, they would continue to have rights to fish in British sea lanes, and so on and so forth. Nonetheless, with the signing of the Treaty of Paris, when it arrives back over in the American colonies a little bit later on, it will be ratified. The War of Independence was over. However, even though America has gained its independence, it was still very much in question on whether or not this new republic would survive. Because the last battle of the Revolution had yet to be fought. Not a military battle, but a political battle. Because the governing documents of the American Revolution, or I should say of the revolutionary cause, out of the Articles of Confederation, they created a weak central government. America was on the verge of bankruptcy. And this government had virtually no power to overturn that. But we will see in the next lecture how this last battle of the Revolution will play out. But anyways, that brings us to an end of our discussion over the American Revolution. Now, this is a lot of material that I covered in just a very short time. But anyways, do read through the articles that are provided for y'all. I'll give you a much more detailed background of everything that we talked about within this lecture. Also, make sure that you read the corresponding chapter in the textbook. But in the meantime, complete any outstanding assignments, complete any assignments that are coming up. But otherwise, everybody go out, take care, and I'll see y'all next time.